The cell was dark stone, narrow and cold. A single beam of light slipped through the cracks of the wooden door, falling upon the face of a frail friar whose lips moved in silent prayer. His body was broken, his back scarred from lashes, his stomach empty from days of fasting. Yet, in that suffocating darkness, his spirit burned with divine fire. From those depths of torment would rise one of Christianity's most luminous voices, the Spanish friar the world would come to know as John of the Cross. Born in poverty, imprisoned by his own brethren, ignored, misunderstood, and yet aflame with an indescribable love for God, John of the Cross transformed his suffering into timeless poetry and spiritual wisdom. His words on the dark night of the soul have outlived centuries, guiding saints, seekers, and souls in distress toward the mystery of divine union. This is the story of a man who discovered heaven not in light, but in shadow, who found God not in comfort, but in the cross. This is the life and ministry of John of the Cross, reformer, mystic, and poet of divine love. Juan de Yepes y Alvarez entered the world on June 24, 1542, in the small Castilian village of Fontiveros, Spain. His birth was humble, his family poor, his beginnings meager, yet divine providence was already at work. His father, Gonzalo, had been disowned by his wealthy silk merchant relatives after marrying Catalina Alvarez, a low-born orphan. Love had cost them comfort, and when Gonzalo died a few years later, the little household fell into deep poverty. Catalina struggled to feed her 3 sons. The family wandered from one Spanish town to another, Arevalo, then Medina del Campo, searching for work and bread. It was a harsh upbringing, cold winters, hunger, and the silent dignity of endurance. John would later see in these sufferings the first steps of his spiritual ascent. From a young age, Juan was drawn to the sacred. He served as an altar boy in a nearby Augustinian convent, captivated by the sight of candles, vestments, and the mystery of prayer. His mother noticed his gentle temperament, quiet, introspective, and compassionate toward the poor. He was the child who would give away his portion of bread to beggars and spend hours in the chapel alone. At about age 9, he was admitted to a school for poor children run by the church. There he learned the basics of reading and writing and showed unusual intelligence. Later, he entered the Jesuit college in Medina, where he studied grammar, Latin, rhetoric, and religion. His teachers saw in him a contemplative nature, one who learned not for prestige, but to understand God more deeply. It was during these formative years that Juan discovered 2 enduring loves: the love of learning and the love of God. The Renaissance currents of his time exalted reason, but John's mind turned to the mysteries of the soul. The world around him was changing. Spain was rich from empire and conquest, yet within Juan there stirred a hunger not for gold or glory, but for the invisible. When his studies ended, he took work at the Hospital of the Conception in Medina, caring for the sick and destitute. It was here that he learned compassion in its most brutal form. The cries of dying patients, the stench of disease, the loneliness of those forgotten by the world. The young man often spent nights praying beside their beds, whispering scripture to those in agony. This encounter with human suffering would later infuse his writings with deep empathy. His theology was never cold. It was forged in the fire of human pain. Yet within him a longing burned stronger, a longing for silence, prayer, and total consecration. The hospital work was noble, but his heart was restless. The same fire that consumed Francis of Assisi and Teresa of Ávila was beginning to consume Juan de Yepes. In 1563, at the age of 21, Juan entered the Carmelite order in Medina del Campo. He took the religious name Brother John of St. Matthias and immersed himself in a life of prayer, fasting, and obedience. The Carmelites were an ancient order with roots in the hermits of Mount Carmel in Palestine, yet by the 16th century the order had grown wealthy and lax. Many friars lived comfortably, far from the austerity of their founders. John felt disillusioned. He longed for a purer life of contemplation. After his novitiate, John was sent to the University of Salamanca, one of Europe's greatest centers of learning. There, from 1564 to 1567, he studied philosophy and theology under some of the brightest scholars of the day. But while others debated theology, John sought to live it. He fasted rigorously, slept little, and prayed much. His discipline was not pride but passion, an all-consuming desire to strip away everything that hindered union with God. He was ordained a priest in 1567, a moment that filled him with joy but also uncertainty. He considered leaving the Carmelites altogether to join the Carthusians, known for their silence and solitude. "I seek a stricter life," he confided to friends. Yet God had other plans. That same year, Teresa of Ávila visited Medina del Campo. She was already renowned across Spain for her mystical experiences and for initiating a reform of the Carmelite nuns, a return to simplicity, poverty, and prayer. When she met the young priest, she recognized something extraordinary in him. "I have found the man I have long sought," she is said to have exclaimed. Teresa invited John to join her reform, to help restore the men's branch of the Carmelites to its original purity. John hesitated only briefly. He had dreamed of solitude, but Teresa opened to him a greater vision, a community of reformed friars devoted entirely to the inner life. On November 28, 1568, in a small farmhouse at Duruelo, the first Descalced Carmelite monastery was born. Descalced, meaning barefoot, symbolized their radical poverty. Only 3 friars began the experiment, living on alms, sleeping on straw, and wearing coarse habits. They prayed day and night, alternating silence with scripture, penance with joy. Here John took his final name, John of the Cross. It was not a title of suffering alone, but of transformation. The cross, for him, was not tragedy but gateway, the narrow door through which one must pass to find God. The reform spread quickly. By 1570, John helped found another house in Mansera, then others in Pastrana and Alcalá de Henares. La Provetion, he became a spiritual father to many young friars, teaching that perfection was not found in visions or ecstasies, but in humble obedience and self-forgetting love. He taught them to seek not feelings, but faith, not consolations, but Christ crucified. In 1572, Teresa called him to serve as confessor and spiritual director for her reformed convent in Avila. There, surrounded by Teresa's nuns, John entered a period of extraordinary grace. The sisters testified to his gentleness and wisdom, a man whose presence brought peace. He guided them through doubts, dryness, and joy alike, shaping the inner life of the community through confession and counsel. But the reform's growing influence also aroused jealousy. Many of the unreformed Carmelites viewed John and Teresa as rebels, disturbers of peace, disobedient to authority. Rumors began to swirl. Hostility grew within the very family of Carmel. The storm was about to break. Tension built quietly at first, like the tightening of a bowstring. Letters were sent between convents. Superiors complained that John and Teresa were leading friars into fanaticism. Others accused them of pride, of claiming to reform what centuries had already sanctified. John, for his part, remained calm. "Where there is no love," he wrote later, "put love, and you will draw out love." Yet beneath his peace lay an awareness that persecution was coming. Between 1572 and 1577, he continued his service in Avila, acting as confessor for the nuns at St. Joseph's Convent. Teresa regarded him with deep affection, often calling him mi padre, my father. His humility, patience, and discernment became the heart of her reform. But as the movement gained followers, pressure intensified. The General Chapter of the Carmelites in Piacenza, 1575, issued a decree ordering all reform houses to submit to the authority of the unreformed superiors. The Descalzes were forbidden to found new monasteries. For Teresa and John, this was devastating, a command that threatened to extinguish their hard-won renewal. In 1576, John was briefly arrested in Medina del Campo by opponents of the reform, though released soon after. But 2 years later, events turned tragic. On the night of December 2, 1577, a group of hostile Carmelites broke into the house where John lived in Ávila. They dragged him away under cover of darkness, accusing him of rebellion against the order. He was taken to Toledo, where he was thrown into a small stone cell, no window, barely a slit for air, scarcely large enough to stretch his legs. For 9 months, John remained imprisoned there. He was fed only scraps of bread and water. Every Friday, he was publicly flogged before the community of friars. He was forbidden to say Mass. He had only a tattered blanket for warmth in the bitter Castilian winter. His body weakened, his face grew gaunt, yet his soul soared. It was in that dungeon that he entered what he would later call La Noche Oscura del Alma, the dark night of the soul. Here, in silence and suffering, John discovered a truth: that the path to divine union is through the night of purification, when all earthly lights are extinguished and only faith remains. In the darkness, he began to compose verses, secretly, on scraps of paper smuggled in by a sympathetic jailer. These lines would later become the foundation of his most famous poem, the Spiritual Canticle, in which the soul, depicted as a bride, searches for the beloved, Christ, through a garden of shadows until she finds perfect union. Where have you hidden, beloved, and left me moaning? You fled like the stag after wounding me. I went out calling you, but you were gone. His poetry was not escape, it was revelation. Every image, every metaphor flowed from his mystical encounter in that prison cell. He wrote not of despair, but of transformation, of how the soul, stripped of all earthly joy, becomes capable of receiving divine love in its purest form. Finally, on the night of August 16, 1578, John made a daring escape. Having managed to loosen the lock of his door with improvised tools, he lowered himself from a window by a rope of torn blankets and fled into the streets of Toledo under moonlight. Weak and barefoot, he found refuge with the nearby discalced Carmelite nuns who nursed him back to health. Free once again, John of the Cross entered the most creative and fruitful years of his life. Between 1578 and 1586, he poured forth the treasures of divine wisdom gathered in his suffering. He took refuge first in Andalusia, where he founded several new houses of the Descalced Carmelites, notably in Baeza, Granada, and Malaga. These monasteries became centers of prayer, study, and reform. His presence was gentle but commanding. Those who met him spoke of a peace that seemed unearthly, a man whose eyes reflected both humility and fire. During this period, he wrote his 4 great works of theology. 1. The Ascent of Mount Carmel, a guide to the soul's journey toward God, describing the purification of senses and spirit. 2. The Dark Night of the Soul, a poetic and theological commentary on the soul's painful yet blessed passage through spiritual darkness. 3. The Spiritual Canticle, his lyrical masterpiece of divine love between the soul and Christ. 4. The Living Flame of Love, the summit of his mystical vision, describing the soul in perfect union with God, consumed by love's fire. In 1580, the reform received papal recognition. Pope Gregory XIII issued the bull Pia Consideratione, legally separating the Descalced Carmelites from the unreformed branch. This was the triumph Teresa and John had long prayed for: freedom to pursue their vocation in peace. John's reputation as a spiritual director spread rapidly. In 1581, he was elected a member of the governing body Definitor of the new order and helped draft its constitutions. His counsel guided many, friars, nuns, and laypersons alike, yet fame did not touch his humility. He lived simply, often walking barefoot through the rugged Spanish hills between monasteries, carrying nothing but a breviary and rosary. In Granada, he wrote the greater part of the Ascent and the Dark Night. The beauty of nature around him, the Sierra Nevada mountains, the olive groves, the clear skies, often inspired his imagery. But his theology remained inward, the soul ascending, not physical peaks, but spiritual ones. He taught that to reach union with God, one must pass through 3 stages. 1. Purgation, the stripping away of attachments and self-love. 2. Illumination, the infusion of divine light and understanding. 3. Union, the complete transformation of the soul in God's love. Meanwhile, his spiritual companion, Teresa of Ávila, was nearing the end of her earthly journey. She died in 1582, leaving the reform largely in his hands. John mourned her deeply. She had been both mentor and sister in the spirit, the one who had recognized his call. Her passing only deepened his resolve to guard and expand the reform. By 1584, his writings circulated widely in manuscript form, copied eagerly by friars and nuns. His words, though rooted in personal experience, resonated with countless souls. Spain's Golden Age produced many poets, but none so filled with divine fire as John of the Cross. At the General Chapter of 1585, John was elected Vicar Provincial of Andalusia. From his base in Granada, he traveled ceaselessly on foot or donkey, visiting monasteries scattered across the rugged southern provinces of Spain. He oversaw 7 new foundations, ensuring that each remained faithful to the Reform's founding spirit: silence, poverty, prayer, and community love. His journeys were often long and dangerous. He slept in poor inns, crossed mountain passes in winter, and preached in small towns where few had seen a monk so austere. Yet, wherever he went, renewal followed. Friars later testified that his arrival brought peace. His presence seemed to calm tempers and restore zeal. John's administrative letters from this period reveal both his humanity and firmness. He warned his communities against the twin dangers of laxity and pride. A single act of pure love, he reminded them, is worth more to the Church than all good works together. He balanced discipline with tenderness, ever mindful that reform without love becomes tyranny. By 1586, John of the Cross had become one of the leading figures of the Discalced Carmelite reform. His wisdom, holiness, and literary brilliance had made him the movement's quiet architect after Teresa of Avila's death. Yet, true to his nature, he sought no titles, no honors, only service. By 1588, John was called back to Segovia, where he served as prior. There he completed final revisions of the Living Flame of Love, his most exalted work. In it, he described the soul's perfect union with God, not as mere vision, but as participation in divine love. The soul becoming a living flame, burning with the same fire that is God himself. O living flame of love that tenderly wounds my soul in its deepest center, since now you are not oppressive, perfect now your work, if it be your will. Tear through the veil of this sweet encounter. These were not abstract words. To those who knew him, John seemed to live already in that flame. His gaze was serene, his speech measured, his laughter quiet and pure. Though he suffered ill health and constant fatigue, he radiated peace. In 1590, however, internal conflicts once again tested his humility. Nicolas Doria, the powerful vicar general of the order, sought to centralize authority and enforce new administrative rules that John believed would stifle spiritual freedom. John resisted gently but firmly, advocating a balance between structure and the liberty of the spirit. Doria took offense. In June 1591, John was removed from his office as prior of Segovia and sent to a remote monastery at La Penuela, deep in the Andalusian wilderness. There, far from the centers of power, John welcomed the exile as a gift. He spent his final months in prayer and solitude, serving as gardener and infirmarian to the small community. He wrote letters full of humility. Where there is no love, put love, and you will find love. To his followers who wept over his demotion, he said, "Where is the disgrace in being like Jesus, who was despised by men?" Soon illness struck, an infection known as erysipelas, beginning as an ulcer on his leg. It spread rapidly, causing intense pain. He was transferred to the monastery in Ubeda for treatment, but the prior there, resentful of John's fame, treated him harshly. Even on his deathbed, John endured misunderstanding, yet he bore it with joy, saying, "I suffer, but I am not suffering, for I am in love." On the night of December 13, 1591, John asked the friars to read the Song of Songs aloud to him. As the words of divine love filled the room, he whispered, "I am going to sing the office in heaven." A few hours later, just before midnight, he uttered his final words, "Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." He was 49 years old. The cell was silent. The same light that had once entered his prison in Toledo now seemed to bathe him in glory. The next morning, word spread through Ubeda that a saint had died. People crowded the monastery gates, cutting pieces of his habit as relics. His body, incorrupt and fragrant, was later moved to Segovia, where it still rests today. The story of John of the Cross did not end with his death. It began anew. His writings, preserved and circulated by the disculted Carmelites, quickly spread across Spain and beyond. Readers found in them a map of the soul's ascent to God, a theology not confined to scholars, but accessible to all who sought deeper prayer. Through the centuries, his influence has shaped the spirituality of saints, theologians, poets, and ordinary believers alike. Therese of Lisieux, Edith Stein, and Thomas Merton all drank deeply from his writings. His phrase, "dark night of the soul," entered not only Christian theology, but world literature, describing the soul's passage through suffering into divine light. His Ascent of Mount Carmel remains one of the clearest expositions of guiding seekers through purification of senses, detachment, and total surrender to God's will. The dark night continues that journey, showing how God leads the soul through apparent abandonment into intimate union. The Spiritual Canticle and the living flame of love complete the vision. Love purified, fulfilled, and consumed in God. Modern psychology and literature have borrowed from his insight that transformation often occurs in the darkness, that loss and suffering can be instruments of grace. His message is timeless. To find God, one must go beyond all that is not God. To love God, one must let go of everything that is not love. Even in the 21st century, St. John of the Cross remains a guiding light for those navigating the silence between faith and despair. His works bridge theology and poetry, suffering and glory. The poor child of Fontiveros who once wandered hungry beside his widowed mother became the priest of love who taught the world that the shortest road to heaven passes through the heart of suffering. When he wrote, "In the evening of life we shall be judged on love alone," he was not writing philosophy, he was writing his own epitaph. The story of John of the Cross is not only history, it is invitation to walk the same narrow way, to embrace the same transforming fire, to believe that even in our darkest night, divine light is near.